Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm your host today, Steve Francisco. You know, one of the pleasures of doing this show is getting to meet lots of different people from our community who do lots of different things, make lots of contributions to making life better for people who live here. And it's always fun to talk to people who are knowledgeable. And our guest today, Professor David Schultz from Hamline University, is certainly one of the most knowledgeable people that I know on subjects of American politics and law and government. And it's a pleasure to welcome you back to our set today, David. Welcome to Access to Democracy.
It's great to be back again. It's been a while.
It has been a while.
Sure.
So a lot happening in the news these days. Particularly with respect to the events that have unfolded in Crimea and in the Ukraine with respect to Russia. And it was news to me before this interview that you have actually had some considerable experience having taught in that part of the world and made a number of contacts there. Tell us a little bit about your background having been in the Ukraine.
Sure. Okay, back in 2012, I taught in Ukraine for a few weeks, and I taught at a school, Taras Shevchenko University, which is literally less than about a mile from Independence Square, the Maidan. If anybody's seen on the news where all the protests were occurring, so literally right down there. And
that was the epicenter of the protests, right? Where everybody was.
Exactly, exactly. And so I've managed to stay in contact with some of the students and a couple of the faculty members from when I was teaching there. Again, the internet has not always been the best in terms of staying in contact, in terms of it's been down, it's been up, and so forth. But I've had contacts with them. But on the flip side also, which also gives me an unusual perspective too, I've taught in Moscow 6 times, and the last time I was in Moscow was this past October. So I have friends and students and some colleagues in both countries. And where I sort of want to start with my discussion of Kiev, it's just in terms of my observations, because right off the bat, when I got to Kiev, it had this thoroughly Western feel. You know, when I'm riding the subway or the metro in Kiev and walking downtown right around where Independence Square was, it felt like any other city in the United States. I'm sitting there watching people fiddling with their cell phones or their Androids, going to restaurants, and looking at the stores. It felt thoroughly Western. And talking to my students, again, I don't speak Ukrainian, I speak very little Russian, but all the young people all know English. And so there's this real push towards the West. But at the same time, you got the sense, again, this is October of 2012, something was going to happen. Because literally right down in Independence Square, where this permanent encampment with these big billboards translated into English that said, "Free Yulia Tymoshenko," who was the jailed opposition leader. So you could literally feel from talking to people that the society was opening up, it was moving west, and they were very angry about the sense in which they felt like their democracy, their Orange Revolution had been taken away, and one of their heroes had been arrested. So now looking back, of course, with 2020 hindsight, look at it and say, my gosh, I could see the roots of what happened earlier this year.
Over a year and a half ago, before it happened.
Yes.
So you were not really surprised by the events that we've all been transfixed in front of the TV seeing the events in Ukraine and Crimea. It doesn't surprise you what happened, the political explosion.
Well, clearly what didn't surprise me was eventually the takeover of Independence Square and the ousting of the government. What did surprise me somewhat, of course, is clearly how Putin and Russia tried to take advantage of that instability in terms of moving into Crimea. But even on one level, that didn't surprise me in terms of it, because one of the things that people need to understand is that Russians view the Ukraine as the seat or as the origin of Russia. That this has been part of Russia for so many years and part of Russia's sphere of influence, and that Putin, I don't think, wants to be known as the leader who lost Ukraine.
Right.
At the same time, people don't remember that Ukraine has been part of Russia for over Crimea has been part of Russia for over 200 years. It was Khrushchev back in the 50s that said, we're going to give Crimea to Ukraine. So there's this huge historical connection between Crimea, going back to Peter the Great, and part of why the Russians always wanted Crimea was because they wanted a warm water port for their navy. And so even to this day, or even, let's say, go back a couple of months, even before the Russian takeover or acquisition, I like to say, acquisition of Crimea, they still had in Sevastopol their fleet there with an agreement from Ukraine. So you could see the setup. You could see that Ukraine wants to move west. Putin doesn't want to lose Ukraine, doesn't want to lose this warm water fleet, this historical connections between Kiev, Ukraine, and Russia, all of a recipe for some kind of conflict that just exploded literally.
And here it is. And
Yeah.
it seems we've all been hearing on the news about, some of the sanctions that are being imposed. President Obama in the United States and Western European leaders, Angela Merkel from Germany and others, levying economic sanctions. Russia's now been kicked out of the G8 because of these events that have happened over there. But these really don't seem to be affecting Mr. Putin, do they? He really is very much emerging as really a Russian nationalist, playing to Russian nationalist sentiment.
I think you're absolutely right. I think a couple things are going on here, and maybe it's part of Russian psyche, but Russians have had to endure incredible amounts of hardship over the years. Now, maybe not with the current generation, but for Putin, the idea of saying, okay, if Crimea is this important to me, I am willing, he's saying he's willing, and making Russia willing to endure significant pain, even though it may hurt to do it. And so they're willing to go through all these embargoes, all the financial limitations and penalties, but that's not going to get them to move. Now, I don't think anybody thinks that any of the financial sanctions are going to actually get him to leave Crimea. The question becomes, what is the longer-term impact in terms of what these financial sanctions will have in terms of the Russian banking system and so forth? But even then...
And it's probably going to stifle Western investment over there. I would think that would be one of the first consequences, and they're hoping they can elevate the level of economic pain.
Right.
But you still don't see that as changing Putin's behavior, because this is a much higher priority for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think the stronger priority at this point ought to be for the United States and the European Union to strengthen the Ukrainian economy. And that's in a couple of different ways. One, in terms of loan packages and helping them restructure. But more importantly, the biggest vulnerability for Ukraine, and clearly for Europe, is on energy. They're highly dependent upon Russian oil and natural gas. Ukraine is almost totally dependent upon Russia for this. And longer term, what we need to be doing is to figure out how we can actually develop energy policies that will help them achieve some kind of independence. I think the whole strategy that Merkel and the EU and the United States has hoped for the last 20 years has been the idea of saying we will so integrate Russia into the Western economies, into Western capitalist systems, that they'll never take these kind of actions. And basically we misread Putin, or Putin just basically said...
Or we misread Russian history.
Yeah. Or we have forgotten the fact that Putin still thinks in that old mindset as a former KGB agent, and therefore he's not interested in this integration. And so what we are now is clearly a major rethinking of our policy, foreign policy in the United States and European Union vis-a-vis Russia and what we need to do with Ukraine.
You were sharing with me before we started taping today, you have a story you wanted to share with us about nearly getting arrested in Russia, and an interesting some interesting information you learned in that process.
Yes, this is actually a great story, is that I've gone over to Russia several times on behalf, as a State Department, as an independent scholar, to go speak. And one of the things most Americans don't know is that we operate cultural affair offices across the world, which we call the American Corners. And it's a place where, in the case of Moscow, Russians can go get books in English, learn about the United States. And so I've spoken there before. Again, last October I was teaching at a great name of a university. I was teaching at the People's Friendship University in Moscow. And I'd set up to go speak at the American Corner, showed up at the American Corner. The person who's the director there, as I walk in, says, just go in the back, have a cup of tea, and go keep quiet for a while. So I go hang out in the back, and eventually she comes back, takes a couple of calls from the embassy there. Upshot is that apparently a week before, the U.S. had expelled some Russians from the United States, claiming they were spies. And so it's called the FSB now, Federal Security Bureau, which is really the KGB, came into the American Corner making noise about basically wanting to arrest people as spies. And so I happened to be there at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the director of the American Corner and I just escaped by a whisper, because essentially the U.S. Embassy called him and said that, listen, if you're going to arrest somebody and expel them, make it worth your while, on this one. So what I learned.
And a professor from Hamline University, I guess, didn't quite measure up to that.
No.
That degree of.
That's right. I'm not that important, although I would have become really important had that happened or something like that.
Yeah.
But what I sort of learned from it, what I've learned from my visits to Moscow, by the way, is I've seen over about a 6 or 7 year period that socially, Russia is still open. I talk to my students, I talk to those people, they are open, they're thinking West, they have a different perspective than that older generation. But we have, again, Russia's socially opening, but politically closing. I've seen it in the last 6 years, and that's not a good sign, because Putin is trying to crack down at this point.
Let's change gears a little bit. Very interesting insights and views about foreign policy and what's happening over there. Let's shift gears a little bit to politics and here at home. There was a famous Supreme Court decision a couple of years back, Citizens United, and there's been a lot of fallout from that decision. And one of the topics I wanted to ask you about is that there seems to be more and more alienation of Americans from politics and from their own government.
Yes.
Interviewed Mike Obermuller, candidate for Congress, and I mentioned a Gallup poll rating of the U.S. Congress. The approval rating in January this year was 13%. Now, probably throughout most of our history, Congress has never enjoyed stellar ratings, but it seems that we've really sunk to a new low in terms of Americans' approval of their own government. What's going on here, and how does a decision like Citizens United, tell our viewers briefly what Citizens United was, and how does this relate to some of the things we see happening in our politics?
Okay, what Citizens United was all about is that there used to be a federal law that barred corporations from spending money to try to influence federal elections. And what that decision did was to say that no, corporations can either directly out of their own corporate treasury or contributing it through political action committees can now spend an unlimited amount of money to influence campaigns and elections. Now, they can't give it directly to the candidate. That's still illegal. But essentially right now, if I have, I don't know, Acme Widget Company and it's worth $50 billion, and if I want to liquidate my entire corporate treasury and spend that for the purposes of trying to influence a federal or state election.
You can now do it.
I can now do that.
You have the green light.
Green light to do that. And clearly what we have seen since Citizens United is many corporations step up and are spending a lot more money now to influence the political process. Now,
and wasn't part of the rationale in Citizens United that the court said corporations are people?
Yes, they're people, and they have First Amendment rights in the same way that you and I have First Amendment rights to free speech, and therefore barring a corporation from being able to expend money is no different than censorship. And so it makes two assumptions here which are highly contestable. First, that in fact money is speech, and we can have a great debate on that, because I think Justice Stevens once said, well, money is a thing. Money is not speech. And we have many instances where we restrict how people use money for political purpose, or many instances where how we restrict people how they use money. For example, I can't extort people for money.
Right,
I can't use blackmail, et cetera, et cetera. I can't bribe people. So money is not speech. But the second thing was this also assumption that, in fact, corporations are individuals or persons who have First Amendment rights. And those are, so both the money and speech and corporations are people, highly contestable.
Isn't this a very dangerous idea, though, in
Yes.
a democracy where we believe that each individual, you and I, we're equal.
Right.
We each have one vote.
Right.
But you can have a corporation that has millions, billions of dollars.
Right.
Or individuals like the Koch brothers or other folks who come into the political process, dump millions into a political campaign, and is that equal to the rest of us? It really seems like a perversion of the political process.
It is a perversion of, instead of the one person, one vote, it's the $1, one vote. That you have as much influence as you have dollars at this point. And I think a variety of things clearly are alienating Americans from the political system. I was going to say, first off, when you told me it was 13% approval rating for Congress,
you were surprised it was that high.
That's right. Right. Because
that was in January.
That was in January. I mean, what I've read is at this point, though, is that cockroaches and bed bugs poll higher than Congress at this point. So you wonder who these 13% were who actually do approve. But clearly, I think it's the partisan disagreement. It is especially on the part, I think, of Republicans at this point who have moved much further to the right and unwillingness to compromise on a lot of issues. I think in many situations we have this basic philosophical difference now that I think all of us used to take an assumption that government is important, it's relevant, it can do important things in our lives. I think increasingly many of the Tea Party members question one of the most basic assumptions why government. But I have to think that money is a big issue also. When I talk to my students, and I'm teaching undergraduates again this semester, my undergraduates talk all about how much money's dumped into the political process, and they feel like they've been squashed out. They think, why should I vote when somebody can go out there and dump $1 million or $1 billion into a campaign in terms of trying to influence its outcome? So I think what Citizens United did was to unleash just this incredible extra cynicism in the political process. To me, essentially what it did was to say that the running for office is no different in terms of buying a sailboat or buying soap. And what I mean by that, dollars are an okay way to allocate sailboats, to allocate cars.
Right.
But should dollars be a way to allocate political power and influence? No. A democracy is not about letting dollars translate over into political influence. I always quote Justice Rehnquist, very conservative member of the Supreme Court, who once said that it's perfectly legitimate for us to say that resources amassed in the economic marketplace should be shielded from having an influence in the political marketplace. He's fundamentally correct in that we need to have these walls of separation between conversion of economic resources over into political resources.
And that is the voice of a conservative.
Yes.
Justice William Rehnquist, former Chief Justice.
Who is very, very worried about power of corporations.
Right.
And people forget that.
But haven't we seen in American history, David, when you look back and we saw the robber baron era, the late 1800s, and there was a reaction to it, the rise of the progressive movement.
Right.
Do you see the potential for something similar to happen here with the fallout from Citizens United? Are we going to see an effort to repeal this by way of a constitutional amendment? Or is there anything that you see happening that will have an impact in mitigating these bad effects that you see flowing from this Supreme Court decision?
Well, if you look at public opinion polls, about 80% of American public opinion opposes Citizens United and supports some restrictions on money in politics. So there's an enormous amount of support. Whether or not that can get through the political process because of what? The power of these special interests in corporations to basically prevent the reforms from occurring, that's a real question here. Now, another justice, William Brennan, used to always say on the first day of the term, talking to his clerks, that everything is about 5. That is 5 justices on the court. and one of the ways to deal with Citizens United is to get that coalition together of 5 justices who eventually might come back and say, we got it wrong in Citizens United.
A majority, 5 out of 9.
5 out of 9.
Right.
And I see that as a possibility. But But we have to think about where we are because the parallels are there. Early part of the 20th century, corporations had enormous power. The gap between rich and poor was absolutely enormous, much in the same way that we have now. And it was a Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, who said that we have to take action to be able to do something. And so
others, people like La Follette from Wisconsin, Norris from Nebraska.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing, and this is where I support Barack Obama, is this language where he wants to make the gap between rich and poor and inequality a central issue, because that is the central issue of our time. Archibald Cox, former special prosecutor in Watergate, fired by Nixon on Saturday night, was the head of Common Cause. And back when I was with Common Cause, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Archibald Cox once. And he once turned to me and he said, the rules about money in politics are the rules that determine the rules of the game. And that was exactly right. He says, how we allow people to spend money determines how politics is going to be played and who the winners and losers are. No different than the house rules that we have when we play Monopoly or Life or any other board game in our house.
Let's shift gears, talk about health care. There is a very important case before the U.S. Supreme Court this term called the Hobby Lobby case. Tell us about what is the Hobby Lobby case? How does it relate to the Affordable Care Act and the Obamacare?
Sure. Well, it actually relates to both the Affordable Care Act and it relates to Citizens United, because Hobby Lobby, owned by a very conservative individual, religiously conservative individual, who argues that he should not have to be able to provide health insurance for employees where it involves reproductive rights or involves, actually in this case, contraception. We're not even talking about abortion. We're talking about he does not want to provide health insurance plans that would provide for contraception for women. And he's arguing that to be required to do so violates his corporation's First Amendment free exercise of religion rights. Right. And so where it relates to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is in terms of this is a delicately crafted compromise that the Catholic Church, religious groups, and the Obama and Democrats worked out in terms of still saying we want to be able to provide contraceptives for women. At the same time, it's a case that rests upon the logic, all of what? All of Citizens United. Because if, in fact, corporations are persons, do corporations have what? Free exercise of religion rights.
Just as you and I would as individuals.
Right. Now, as far as I know, I haven't seen too many corporations pray. I don't see too many corporations in church or in temple on Sunday. But this is what this case is about. And it's about also something more fundamental, too. Not just about the religious rights of a corporation, which shouldn't exist, but it's about whose rights are more important. Are they about the rights of a corporation, or are they about the rights of workers and individuals in the United States? Because if we now let and say a corporation say, I don't want to spend money on health care if it's going to go for what? For contraception. Why not now say in the future, I don't want to have my health care go and provide for drugs for people who are for Alzheimer's, or for children who have HD, AD, things like that. And so it opens up this enormous window that's no different, by the way, no different than the law in Arizona that the governor vetoed a few weeks ago, that Jan Brewer, that would have given people the right to discriminate on religious grounds.
Well, it reminds me too, during the debate, a totally different law, but a somewhat similar issue, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when the U.S. Congress was debating the public accommodation section, and there were owners of businesses, restaurants, hotels, who said, this is unconstitutional. You can't tell me who I have to serve. But the U.S. Supreme Court said otherwise in upholding the Civil Rights Act, and said if you hold yourself out to serve the public, you must serve all of the public.
Exactly. And people
so how is that different from the Hobby Lobby case? And could that decision possibly be cited as a precedent for rejecting the plaintiff's petition in Hobby Lobby?
It should be. I also point out that many people who argued against the constitutionality of the '64 Civil Rights Act also made the argument on religious grounds also. And so, to me, the debate is no different than it was from the 1960s. I mean, essentially in the end here, what the court said, in upholding the '64 Civil Rights Act and in upholding much of our civil rights legislation the last 30 or 40 years, you can believe whatever you want. No one's telling you what you have to believe. But if you're going to run a restaurant, you've got to hold it open for everybody.
Right.
And if you don't want to do that, shut it down. But the thing is, we live in a different society. You do not have a right to basically be able to operate in such a way that you preempt the rights of others. Because if we took it in the same direction here, again, back in the 1960s, early 1960s, states justified laws that banned mixed race couples.
Interracial marriage, right.
By saying it's against God's law. And
That's
so
right.
to me, this debate is just totally reminiscent of what happened then. And
It's sort of the progeny of all these earlier cases, isn't it?
It is. And in between what's happened is we have a couple of sort of, I would say, dumb decisions like Citizens United that have mucked things up that otherwise should have no bearing on this whatsoever.
David, I want to ask you about something else. We're on this roll on the Supreme Court and legal cases, and recently one of the justices of our U.S. Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, hit a milestone for having gone, I forget how many cases it was, where he didn't ask one single question in oral argument. He was taken to task in a column that appeared, I think it was in the New York Times, by Jeffrey Toobin, who, as you know, is a CNN legal gives legal commentary for CNN, and is an accomplished attorney, a former U.S. prosecutor, etc. But Toobin basically said that Justice Thomas is derelict in his duty for never having asked, or extremely rarely asking, a question in oral argument in cases before the Supreme Court. What's your thought about that? Is he derelict in his duty, as Toobin suggests, or is it okay for a justice to sit there for years and just listen to the other questions from his colleagues? There's no problem with listening. We probably don't do enough listening in our culture. But this is a pattern with Thomas that fits back to the days when he had his confirmation hearing. And recall during his 1990, was it? 1990. 90? Yeah. And I remember at the confirmation hearing, them asking him his opinion on Roe versus Wade, the famous decision that basically legalized abortion for women. And that was a case that was, I think, if I remember correctly, what had been decided not long after he went to law school. And he turned to which was written, by the way, by Justice Harry Blackmun of Minnesota, wrote the majority opinion. Exactly. Yeah. And Clarence Thomas looked to the Senate and said, well, I've never really given much thought about Roe versus Wade. Now, anybody who's ever been to law school, and I teach in law school, know that it's an incredibly controversial decision everybody has. You're definitely going to come across it in constitutional law. Right, and you're going to have to have thought about it at some point. The point that I'm getting at here is if you look at Clarence Thomas's opinions, they look like he's not ever deliberated on the merits of the law and is writing straight from ideology or straight from his own personal convictions. And so him not asking questions makes me wonder to some extent to how much is he really paying attention to the arguments versus the fact is as soon as he puts on his robe, sits behind the bench, has he already made up his decision. And that's the point that I think that Toobin was more deeply making, is that it's showing the sense of unawareness or unreflectiveness on the part of Clarence Thomas in terms of understanding the law. The interesting thing about our Supreme Court and its history, as you know so well, there have been many justices on that court who came into the court and evolved. They grew, they opened their mind, and they may have come in with an ideological perspective, but that changed over time. Right. Actually, I think one of them may have been Harry Blackmun. I had the chance to meet Harry Blackmun once. He said, I didn't really change, the court changed over time. So Harry Blackmun's the best example. I think also the other example is the recently retired a few years ago, Justice Stevens. Both John Paul Stevens. Both Blackmun and Stevens were both appointed by a Republican, and partly they did evolve, but both of them at the end of their career said, I didn't change, the court changed. David Schultz, professor at Hamline University, always interesting to talk to you. We've obviously run out of time again. You're just going to have to come back on the show. Perfect. I'd love to do it. We'd love to have you again. Thank you so much for being with us today on Access to Democracy, and we look forward to having you on again soon. Anytime. Thank you. Thank you.